I never thought I'd be sitting here at 72, clutching a cup of lukewarm coffee in my small kitchen in suburban Ohio, wondering if I made the right choice. The baby shower was 3 months ago, and Sarah still doesn't know the truth. She thinks her aunts, cousins, and I all pitched in equally for that beautiful celebration. She has no idea that every single decoration, every catered sandwich, every pink and gold balloon came from her father's pension money. Money I've been saving like a sacred treasure since he passed 5 years ago. My daughter barely remembers David. She was only 8 when cancer took him, and I've watched her grow into this incredible woman who carries his stubborn chin and his gentle heart, but none of his memories. She calls him Dad in that distant way children do when they're talking about someone who feels more like a story than a person. It breaks something inside me every time. The morning sun streams through my kitchen window, hitting the framed photo of David in his Navy uniform. I touch the glass gently, the way I do every morning, and whisper, "She's having a baby, honey. Our little girl is having a baby." The silence that follows feels heavier than usual, filled with all the moments he'll never see, all the grandfather hugs he'll never give. This house holds so many memories of the 3 of us. The kitchen where David used to make his famous Sunday pancakes, flipping them high in the air while Sarah giggled in her high chair. I can still hear the sizzle of butter in the cast-iron skillet he inherited from his grandmother, still smell the vanilla extract he'd add to make them extra special. The living room where we'd watch Disney movies together, Sarah curled between us on the old blue couch that I still can't bring myself to replace. That couch has seen so many tears, mine mostly, in the dark hours after Sarah went to bed, and I'd allow myself to fall apart. The backyard where David built that elaborate swing set, working every weekend for 2 months because he wanted it to be perfect for his little princess. He'd come in with sawdust in his hair and splinters in his hands, but his eyes would light up when he talked about how high Sarah would swing, how proud she'd be of the fort he was building. That swing set is still there, weathered now, the bright red paint faded to a dusty pink. Sometimes I sit on the porch and watch the neighborhood kids play on it, and I can almost see David pushing Sarah, her pigtails flying behind her as she squealed with delight. After he died, I threw myself into being everything Sarah needed. I worked double shifts at Cincinnati General Hospital, my nursing shoes squeaking down those sterile hallways, while my heart ached for the man who used to rub my feet after those long days. The hospital became my second home, the place where I could lose myself in other people's pain and healing, where I could feel useful and needed when my own home felt too empty, too quiet. I attended every parent-teacher conference alone, sitting in those tiny plastic chairs meant for children, listening to teachers praise Sarah's intelligence and kindness while I fought back tears of pride and grief. I cheered at every soccer game from the sidelines, my voice hoarse from shouting encouragement, wishing David could see how fast she could run, how fearlessly she'd charge toward the goal. I helped with homework at the kitchen table, where David's empty chair seemed to grow larger every year, where I'd catch myself setting 3 plates instead of 2, where I'd save the last piece of pie thinking he might want it later. I thought I was protecting her by not talking about him too much. I thought if I could be strong enough, complete enough, she wouldn't feel the absence as deeply as I did. But watching her now, 24 years old, and glowing with her first pregnancy, I wonder if I robbed her of something precious by keeping his memory locked away in my own grief. The pension check started coming 6 months after the funeral. Every month, like clockwork, a reminder of David's years of service, his sacrifice, his love for his family. I never touched that money. It felt sacred somehow, like it belonged to him, not me. I put it in a separate account at First National Bank and watched it grow, thinking maybe someday I'd know what to do with it. The bank statements would arrive with his name still on them, and I'd trace the letters with my finger, pretending he was still here to discuss our finances over morning coffee. But something happened at that shower that I never expected, something that makes my chest tight with a mixture of joy and heartbreak every time I think about it. The venue was perfect, a charming garden pavilion in Riverside Park, the kind of place David and I used to walk through when Sarah was little. I'd spent weeks planning every detail, using his pension money without a second thought, because I knew somehow that this was exactly what he would have wanted. The pavilion overlooked the Ohio River, with weeping willows creating natural curtains of privacy. The morning mist would rise from the water, creating an almost magical atmosphere that reminded me of the fairy tales David used to read to Sarah. I'd hired the best caterer in town, Margaret Sullivan from Sullivan's Fine Catering, the same woman who'd done the hospital fundraising galas I used to organize when David was alive. Margaret remembered him, remembered how he'd charm the donors at those events with his stories from the Navy, how he'd make everyone laugh while loosening their purse strings for the children's wing renovation. The morning of the shower, I arrived at dawn to oversee the setup. The air was crisp with that October chill that makes Ohio autumns so beautiful. The florist, a young woman named Emma, who reminded me of Sarah at that age, was arranging cascades of white roses and baby's breath, exactly like the bouquet David had given me when Sarah was born. He'd driven to 3 different flower shops that day, determined to find the perfect arrangement to celebrate his 2 beautiful girls. The caterer was setting up elegant silver chafing dishes filled with Sarah's favorite foods: cucumber sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, chocolate-covered strawberries arranged like a bouquet, and those tiny quiches she'd loved since she was a child. I'd given Margaret Sarah's preferences from memory, recalling every birthday party, every special occasion where I'd watched my daughter's face light up over certain foods. I'd spent David's pension money on every detail: the professional photographer who captured candid moments, a woman named Lisa who specialized in family celebrations and had a gift for making people forget the camera was there, the string quartet that played softly in the background, 4 elderly musicians from the Cincinnati Symphony who performed at private events to supplement their retirement income, the hand-calligraphed invitations done by a local artist who used real gold leaf for the lettering, the designer favor boxes filled with imported Belgian chocolates, each one tied with silk ribbon that matched the color scheme. $8,000 total, money that had been accumulating for years, waiting for the right moment. I'd written the check without hesitation, knowing that David would have spent 10 times that amount to see Sarah's face light up the way it did when she walked into that pavilion. Sarah arrived fashionably late, as she always did, wearing that flowing yellow dress that made her look like sunshine itself. Her hand rested on her growing belly in that unconscious way pregnant women do, protective and proud at the same time. When she saw the pavilion, her face lit up like Christmas morning. "Mom, this is incredible. How did you all manage this?" She spun around, taking in the elegant table settings, the professional photographer I'd hired, the dessert table that looked like something from a magazine. Her friends from college were there, girls who'd grown into women I barely recognized, but who still squealed and hugged like teenagers when they saw each other. Her co-workers from the marketing firm where she'd worked her way up from intern to account manager, professional women in their 30s who spoke in acronyms I didn't understand but clearly respected Sarah's intelligence and drive. Neighbors who'd watched her grow up, who remembered her selling Girl Scout cookies door to door and riding her bike up and down our street until the streetlights came on. Everyone was dressed beautifully, the afternoon sun filtering through the pavilion's windows, creating the perfect golden hour lighting that photographers dream of. I watched Sarah move through the crowd, gracious and glowing, accepting congratulations and compliments with the poise David had always said she'd inherited from me. But I could see him in her too, in the way she tilted her head when she laughed, in the way she touched people's arms when she spoke to them, making everyone feel like the most important person in the room. "We all wanted to make this special for you, sweetheart," I said, squeezing her hand, my voice catching slightly on the lie. The words felt heavy in my mouth, weighted with the secret I was carrying. The gift table was overflowing with beautifully wrapped packages in every shade of pink and yellow imaginable. Sarah's best friend Emma had organized a group gift, a top-of-the-line stroller system that cost more than my first car. Her co-workers had pooled their money for a gorgeous nursery set complete with a crib that converted to a toddler bed, a changing table, and a rocking chair that looked like something from a fairy tale. But then something unexpected happened that would change everything. The days following the shower felt different, heavier somehow. I couldn't stop thinking about that compass and the way Sarah's voice had cracked when she mentioned her father. For 24 years, I'd been both mother and father to her, working double shifts at the hospital, attending every school play, every graduation, every heartbreak. I thought I'd done enough to fill the void David left behind. But seeing her hold that compass, seeing that longing in her eyes for a father she barely remembered, made me realize how much she'd been missing without even knowing it. I'd protected her from the depth of our loss, maybe too well. She grew up thinking of David as a distant figure, rather than the man who used to sing her to sleep with old country songs, his voice rough but tender, as he'd croon, "You are my sunshine," while stroking her hair. The man who built her that elaborate dollhouse that still sits in my attic, complete with tiny furniture he'd carved by hand and wallpaper he'd painted with a brush so small I don't know how he managed it. The man who cried the day he found out his cancer had spread because he wouldn't see his little girl grow up, wouldn't walk her down the aisle, wouldn't hold his grandchildren. I'd found him in the garage that night, sitting in his old Chevy with tears streaming down his face, and when I asked what was wrong, he'd said, "I'm going to miss everything, Helen. Everything that matters." The compass incident had shaken something loose in me. I found myself climbing the narrow stairs to the attic more often, pulling down boxes I hadn't touched in years. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, the same sounds they'd made when David would go up there to work on his model ships or to hide Christmas presents. The attic still smelled like him somehow. Sawdust and Old Spice cologne and that particular scent of a man who worked with his hands. David's Navy uniforms hung in garment bags, still pressed and ready for inspection. His collection of model ships lined the shelves he'd built along the walls, destroyers and aircraft carriers and submarines, each one painted with meticulous care and labeled with the dates and battles they'd participated in. He'd known the history of every ship, could tell you about the men who'd served on them, the battles they'd fought, the lives they'd saved or lost. I started going through his things more systematically, opening boxes that had been sealed since the week after his funeral. His old sweaters, still folded the way he'd left them, still smelling faintly of his cologne. His collection of books about naval history and World War II, pages marked with his careful notes in the margins. His tools, organized in the red toolbox his father had given him when he'd enlisted, each one clean and sharp and ready for use. And then I found the letters. A shoebox wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, hidden behind his uniforms like a secret he'd been keeping. Letters addressed to Sarah in his careful handwriting, each envelope marked with an occasion. For Sarah's sweet 16, for my daughter's wedding day, for when you become a mother, for Sarah's first heartbreak, for high school graduation, for when you need to remember how much I love you. There were more than I'd expected. Letters for birthdays I'd already celebrated alone, for milestones that had come and gone without his presence. Letters for occasions that hadn't happened yet, that might never happen. Each one sealed with red wax, each one written with the careful deliberation of a man who knew he was running out of time. One letter was addressed, "For when my little girl becomes a mommy." The envelope was yellowed with age, sealed with wax that had cracked slightly over the years. Inside, his handwriting was careful and deliberate, the way it got when he was trying to say something important. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you're about to experience the greatest joy I ever knew, becoming a parent. I wish I could be there to hold my grandchild, to teach them to fish like I taught you, to build them a treehouse like the one I always planned to build for you but ran out of time." I couldn't finish reading it. Not yet. The words blurred through my tears, and I had to set it aside, my hands shaking with the weight of his love reaching across the years. Every evening, I'd sit in his old recliner, the brown leather one that molded perfectly to his body, that still bears the impression of his form, and wonder if I'd made the right choices. Had I robbed her of knowing her father by trying to shield her from the pain of losing him? Had I been selfish in keeping his memory to myself, hoarding his love like a miser hoards gold? The compass incident had shaken something loose in me, and I found myself making a decision that would change everything between us. I decided to tell Sarah about the letters. Not about the pension money. That secret felt too raw, too complicated, but about the letters her father had written for her future milestones. She deserved to know how much he'd loved her, how he'd tried to be present for moments he knew he'd miss. When I called her, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial her number. The phone felt heavy in my grip, and I had to take 3 deep breaths before I could speak. "Sarah, honey, could you come over this weekend? There's something I need to show you, something important." Her voice brightened immediately, the way it always did when I called. "Of course, Mom. Is everything okay? You sound upset." "I'm fine, sweetheart. It's about your father. There are things I should have shared with you years ago." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Finally, she said, "I'll be there Saturday morning." She arrived earlier than expected, pulling into the driveway in her little Honda Civic just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. She was wearing one of those flowing maternity tops that somehow made her look both fragile and powerful at the same time. Her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger than her 24 years. In her hands was a familiar white box tied with string, David's favorite donuts from Schneider's Bakery downtown. "I've been craving these," she laughed, setting the box on the kitchen counter where David used to read his morning paper, where he'd spread out the sports section and complain about the Reds' pitching staff. "And I thought maybe it was the baby wanting to connect with Grandpa somehow. Isn't that silly?" My heart nearly stopped. She'd never called David Grandpa before. The word hung in the air between us, like a bridge I'd been too afraid to cross, like a door I'd kept locked for 24 years. "It's not silly at all," I whispered, my voice catching. "He would have loved being a grandfather." We sat in the living room, the same room where David used to read her bedtime stories, where we'd opened Christmas presents and celebrated birthdays and watched her take her first steps. I brought out the wooden box I'd kept hidden in my closet for years, David's old jewelry box from when he was a boy, carved with his initials and worn smooth from decades of handling. Sarah's eyes widened as I opened it, revealing the letters arranged chronologically, each one a time capsule of David's hopes and dreams for his daughter. For Sarah's sweet 16, for my daughter's wedding day, for when you become a mother, for Sarah's first heartbreak, for high school graduation, for when you graduate college, for your first job, for when you buy your first house. There were more than I'd remembered, more than I'd been able to process in my grief. Letters for occasions that had already passed, letters for milestones yet to come. Each one sealed with red wax, each one written with the careful deliberation of a man who knew he was running out of time, but refused to let death silence his love. Her hands trembled as she reached for the pregnancy letter, the one that had been waiting 24 years for this moment. "Mom, why didn't you give me these before? Why did you keep them from me?" The question hung between us like an accusation, and I felt the weight of all those years of protection, all those decisions I'd made in grief and love and fear. "I thought they'd hurt too much," I whispered. "I thought if I could be enough for you, you wouldn't need to feel the pain of missing him. I thought I was protecting you." "But I did miss him," she said, her voice breaking. "I missed him every day, and I didn't even know why. I had this hole inside me that I couldn't name, this feeling that something was missing, but I didn't know what." She opened the letter with reverent care, unfolding the pages that had been waiting 24 years to be read. I watched her face as she read her father's words, watched her expression change from curiosity to wonder, to heartbreak, to joy. David's voice seemed to fill the room as she read silently, his love wrapping around us like the warm blankets he used to tuck around her when she had nightmares. "He knew," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Somehow, he knew exactly what I'd need to hear. Listen to this. I know you're probably scared, sweetheart. I was terrified when your mother was pregnant with you. But you're going to be an amazing mother because you have the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. You get that from your mom, but you get your stubborn determination from me, and that baby is going to need both." The afternoon sun filled the room as she read letter after letter, and for the first time in years, David felt present with us. His love filled the spaces between Sarah's sobs, wrapped around us like the warm embrace I'd been missing for so long. But I still couldn't bring myself to tell her about the shower money. The weeks that followed were different between Sarah and me. She'd call more often, sometimes twice a day, asking questions about David that she'd never asked before. What was his favorite song? Did he really build that dollhouse by hand? What did he say when he found out you were pregnant with me? Did he want a boy or a girl? What were his dreams for me? What did he smell like? What was his laugh like? Did he have any bad habits that drove you crazy? I found myself sharing stories I'd kept locked away for decades, stories that had been too painful to tell, but now felt like gifts I could finally give her. How he'd practiced changing diapers on her teddy bear for weeks before she was born, studying parenting books like they were military manuals, taking notes in the margins, and asking me to quiz him on the proper way to burp a baby. How he'd painted her nursery 3 times because he couldn't get the shade of yellow just right. It had to be sunshine yellow, he'd said, like her smile will be. I told her about the recordings he'd made, hours of him reading bedtime stories, singing lullabies, telling her about his childhood in rural Kentucky and his dreams for her future. He'd borrowed a cassette recorder from his friend at the base, and spent entire weekends creating a library of his voice, determined that she'd always be able to hear him say, "I love you," even when he couldn't be there to say it in person. "Can we listen to them?" she asked one afternoon, her hand resting on her growing belly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. We spent an entire Saturday afternoon on the living room floor, surrounded by photo albums and David's old cassette tapes. His voice filled the room, younger and stronger than I remembered, reading "Goodnight Moon" and "The Velveteen Rabbit" with all the character voices he used to do. He'd give the bunny a squeaky voice and the moon a deep, resonant tone, and Sarah would giggle and ask him to do it again. Sarah laughed and cried at the same time, her hands pressed to her stomach, as if she could somehow transmit her father's voice to her unborn child. "He sounds so young," she said, "and so happy. I can hear the smile in his voice." "He was happy," I told her. "You made him happier than I'd ever seen him. He used to say that becoming a father was like discovering a part of himself he didn't know existed, but there was something else happening that I couldn't explain." Sarah had started wearing that mysterious compass on a chain around her neck, and she'd touch it whenever she talked about the baby. The compass had become her talisman, her connection to a father she was finally learning to remember. She'd researched its history online and discovered it was a World War II Navy compass, exactly the kind David would have used during his service in the Pacific. She'd even found old photos of similar compasses in maritime museums, had printed them out and brought them to show me. "Look, Mom, it's exactly like the ones they used on destroyers. Dad would have carried one just like this when he was stationed in the Philippines." The compass seemed to glow against her skin, catching the light in ways that made it look almost alive. Sometimes I'd catch her talking to it, whispering things I couldn't hear, her lips moving in silent conversation with the father she'd never really known. One afternoon she surprised me with a visit. She was carrying a small gift bag from the photography studio and had that mischievous smile she'd inherited from David, the same lopsided grin he'd get when he was planning something special, when he'd hidden a present or planned a surprise that he was bursting to share. "I have something for you, Mom," she said, settling onto the couch with the careful movements of a woman whose center of gravity was shifting daily. Inside the bag was a framed photo, a professional shot from the baby shower of the two of us laughing together, my hand on her belly, both of us glowing with joy. The photographer had captured us in a moment of pure happiness, surrounded by the elegant decorations I'd paid for with David's pension money. We looked like we were sharing a secret, which in a way, we were. But what made my breath catch was the inscription she'd written in her careful handwriting. "To the woman who gave me everything, including the most beautiful baby shower a daughter could ask for. Thank you for loving me enough to make Dad's dreams come true too." My hands shook as I held the frame. I held the... Did she know? Had she somehow figured out the truth about the pension money? Had someone told her about the expense? About how much that day had really cost? The words seemed to shimmer on the glass, heavy with meaning I wasn't sure I understood. She hugged me tight, her growing belly pressed against me, and whispered, "I don't know how you managed such a perfect day, Mom, but I felt Dad there with us, that compass. I think it was his way of letting me know he's still taking care of us through you." As she drove away that evening, I realized that the truth was more complicated than I'd thought. Maybe she didn't need to know about the money. Maybe what mattered was that David's love had found its way to her anyway, through mysterious compasses and perfect baby showers, and a mother who'd finally learned to share his memory instead of hoarding it like a secret. 2 months later, everything changed. Sarah was 7 months pregnant and glowing with that radiant energy that comes in the final trimester. She'd been visiting more often, sometimes bringing dinner and staying to watch old movies on the couch where she used to curl up as a child. We'd developed a new rhythm, a comfortable intimacy built on shared memories of David and anticipation of the baby who would carry his legacy forward. The house had transformed too. Sarah had brought over some of her maternity clothes to keep in the guest room, and I'd found myself buying baby items, tiny socks, soft blankets, picture books with bright illustrations. The nursery items were scattered throughout my house like promises of the joy to come, reminders that our family was growing in ways I'd never dared to hope for. But on this particular Tuesday evening, she arrived with a manila envelope in her hands and tears in her eyes. Not the happy tears I'd grown accustomed to when she talked about the baby, but something deeper, more complicated. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where David used to help her with homework, where we'd celebrated birthdays and discussed report cards and planned her future. The evening light was fading outside, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. I could hear the neighbor's dog barking in the distance, the familiar sounds of suburban life continuing around us while our world was about to shift on its axis. Sarah's hands were shaking slightly as she held the envelope, and I noticed she was wearing the compass, as she always did now. But tonight it seemed to catch the light differently, as if it were trying to prepare us for what was coming. "Mom," she said, her voice steady but strained, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." My heart began to race. The envelope sat between us like a loaded weapon, and I had a sinking feeling I knew what was inside. 24 years of carefully guarded secrets suddenly felt fragile, exposed, ready to crumble at the slightest touch. "What is it, sweetheart?" She opened the envelope with the careful movements of someone handling something precious and dangerous. Inside were bank statements, photocopies that looked official and damning. My name was highlighted in yellow, along with withdrawal amounts that told the story I'd been trying to hide. $8,000 withdrawn from David's pension account 3 days before her baby shower. The evidence was undeniable, laid out in black and white like a confession I'd never intended to make. "The bank called me by mistake," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They thought I was you. We have the same last name, and apparently there was some confusion with the account. They were calling to confirm a large withdrawal, and when I explained who I was, they realized their error. But Mom, they told me about Dad's pension account. They told me about the money you've been saving for 24 years. I stared at the statements, my hands trembling. All those years of keeping David's money sacred, untouched, waiting for the right moment to honor his memory. Every month when those checks arrived, I'd deposited them like a sacred ritual, never spending a penny, never even considering them as available funds. They belonged to David, to his memory, to the future I couldn't yet envision, but somehow knew would come. And when that moment came, when I'd finally found the perfect way to let his love reach his daughter, I'd been discovered. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to give Sarah the perfect gift from her father, I'd inadvertently revealed the depth of the sacrifice I'd been making all these years. "I can explain," I whispered. But she held up her hand, the same gesture David used to make when he needed a moment to process something important. "You paid for everything, didn't you? The venue, the catering, the photographer, the flowers, all of it. You used Dad's pension money to give me the most beautiful day of my life, and you let me believe it was a group effort." The truth hung between us, like a bridge I was finally ready to cross. "Yes," I said simply. "Every penny." She was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting on her belly, the compass glinting at her throat with each breath. The baby was moving inside her. I could see the gentle shifts beneath her maternity top, and I wondered if he could sense the emotional weight of this moment, if he was responding to his mother's elevated heart rate and the tension that filled the room like electricity before a storm. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with tears, but there was something else there too, something that looked like wonder, like the expression she'd worn as a child when she'd discovered something magical and unexpected. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Why did you let me think everyone else had contributed?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 24 years of protection and love and fear settling on my shoulders like a familiar coat. "Because I didn't want you to feel guilty about the money. I didn't want you to think you owed me anything or that I expected gratitude. That money was your father's gift to you, channeled through me. It was always meant to be yours." She reached across the table and took my hands in hers, her skin warm and soft, her grip strong and sure. "Mom, do you know what this means to me? Do you understand what you've given me?" I shook my head, confused by her reaction. I'd expected anger, hurt, maybe even betrayal. I'd prepared myself for accusations of deception, for the possibility that this revelation might damage the fragile trust we'd been rebuilding. But she was smiling through her tears, and the compass at her throat seemed to catch the kitchen light and throw it back at us like a blessing. "You gave me my father," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Not just at the shower, but in everything. The letters, the recordings, the stories, and now this. You've been carrying his love for me all these years, protecting it, saving it, waiting for the right moments to share it. You've been his hands and his voice and his heart, and I never even knew. What would you do in my place? Would you have kept the secret forever? Please subscribe to hear how this incredible story ends, and let me know in the comments what you think about a mother's love that spans decades. The revelation about the pension money changed everything between us, but not in the way I'd feared. Instead of driving us apart, it seemed to dissolve the last barriers I'd built around David's memory. Sarah started coming over every day after work, settling into David's old recliner with her hands on her growing belly, asking me to tell her more stories about the man who'd loved her so completely in the short time they'd had together. Her pregnancy had entered that magical phase where everything seemed to glow from within. Her skin was luminous, her hair thick and shiny, her movements graceful despite her growing size. She'd taken to wearing David's old navy sweater, the soft gray one I'd kept in his closet all these years, and it fit her perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her to claim it. "Tell me about the day I was born," she'd say, settling into the chair that still held the impression of David's body. Or, "What was Dad like when he was nervous?" Or, "Did he really sing to me when I was in the womb?" I found myself sharing memories I'd forgotten I had, stories that had been buried under layers of grief and time, but now surfaced like treasures from a sunken ship. How David had insisted on painting tiny flowers on her nursery walls by hand because he said store-bought stencils weren't personal enough. He'd spent weeks perfecting each petal, each leaf, working by lamplight after his shifts at the base because he wanted everything to be perfect for his daughter's arrival. How he'd practiced walking up and down the hospital corridor for hours before she was born, too nervous to sit still, driving the nurses crazy with his pacing. He'd worn a path in the linoleum, his military-issued shoes squeaking with each step, his hands clasped behind his back in the parade rest position he'd learned in basic training. The nurses had finally given him a job, folding receiving blankets, just to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. How he'd cried the first time he held her, this big, strong Navy man reduced to tears by 8 pounds of wrinkled baby. His hands had shaken as the nurse placed Sarah in his arms, and he'd looked at her with such wonder, such overwhelming love, that I'd fallen in love with him all over again in that moment. "He was terrified he'd break you," I told her one evening, as we sat in the gathering dusk, the autumn light filtering through the windows in golden streams. "You were so tiny, and his hands seemed so big. But the moment you wrapped your little fingers around his thumb, he was lost. He'd hold you for hours, just staring at your face like he was memorizing every detail." Sarah would touch the compass when I told these stories, as if she could somehow feel David's presence through the metal that had once guided him across dangerous waters. The compass had become more than jewelry to her. It was a conduit, a way of connecting with the father she'd never really known, but was finally learning to love. Sometimes I'd catch her whispering to it, her lips moving in silent conversation, and I knew she was talking to David, sharing her hopes and fears about becoming a mother herself. But there were other revelations coming, discoveries that would shake both of us to our core. Sarah had become obsessed with researching David's military service, using the compass as a starting point to trace his time in the Navy. She'd contacted the National Archives, requesting his service records, and had even reached out to veterans organizations, trying to find men who might have served with him. The research had become her evening hobby. She'd arrive with her laptop and a stack of printouts, spreading them across the coffee table like a detective working a case. She'd found ship rosters, battle reports, photographs of David's destroyer in various Pacific ports. Each discovery was like finding another piece of a puzzle she'd never known was incomplete. "Mom," she said one afternoon, arriving with a thick manila envelope that looked official and important, "you need to see this." Inside were David's complete military records, including commendations I'd never seen, medals I'd never known he'd earned, and a citation for heroism that took my breath away. During a typhoon in the Philippine Sea, David had risked his life to save 3 sailors who'd been swept overboard. He'd used his compass to navigate back to the ship in zero visibility, guiding a rescue boat through waves that should have killed them all. The citation was signed by his commanding officer and included witness statements from other sailors who'd been on deck that night. They described David's courage in detail, how he'd volunteered for the rescue mission when others had hesitated, how he'd used his navigational skills to find the drowning men in conditions that made visibility nearly impossible, how he'd refused to give up even when the rescue seemed hopeless. "He never told you about this?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with awe as she read the official commendation. I shook my head, staring at the documents that revealed a side of David I'd never known. He never talked much about the war. He said some things were better left in the past, but there was more. Among the records was a letter David had written to his commanding officer, requesting emergency leave to come home when he'd learned I was pregnant. In the letter, he'd written, "My wife is carrying my child, and I need to be there to make sure they both know how much they mean to me. I've seen too many good men die far from home, and I won't let that happen to my family if I can help it." The letter was typed on official Navy letterhead, but David had added a handwritten note at the bottom. "This baby represents everything I'm fighting for, everything I hope to come home to. I need to be there for the beginning of this new life, because I've seen too much death, and I need to remember what we're all fighting to protect." Sarah read the letter aloud, her voice breaking on the words that revealed the depth of David's love and his fear of losing us. "He came home for us," she whispered. "He could have stayed and finished his tour, but he came home because he loved us." The compass suddenly made sense. It wasn't just a mysterious gift that had appeared at her baby shower. It was David's way of reaching across the years to guide his daughter, just as it had once guided him safely home to us. The same instrument that had saved 3 lives in a Pacific typhoon had somehow found its way to Sarah when she needed it most, carrying with it all the love and protection David had poured into it during those dangerous years at sea. That night, Sarah stayed for dinner, and we sat at the kitchen table looking through David's military records and the photos he'd never shown me. Pictures of him with his shipmates, young men who looked like boys playing at being sailors. Pictures of tropical islands and foreign ports, of ceremonies and celebrations I'd never heard about. Each photograph was like a window into a part of David's life that had been closed to me, a chapter of his story that I was finally able to read. "I wish I'd known him," Sarah said, touching a photo of David in his dress uniform, looking impossibly young and handsome. "Really known him, not just the stories you've told me." "You do know him," I said, covering her hand with mine. "You know him in ways you don't even realize. Every time you tilt your head when you laugh, every time you touch someone's arm when you're talking to them, every time you show kindness to a stranger, that's David. He's in your DNA, in your heart, in the way you move through the world." The baby chose that moment to kick, a strong movement that made Sarah gasp and press her hands to her belly. "I think he agrees," she said, smiling through her tears. "I think Dad's grandson is ready to meet the family." 3 weeks later, at 38 weeks pregnant, Sarah went into labor. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was in my garden pulling weeds when my phone rang. The October air was crisp and clean, the kind of weather that made me think of new beginnings and fresh starts. I'd been working in the flower bed, where David used to plant his tomatoes, thinking about how the seasons change, but the earth remains constant, when Sarah's call changed everything. Her voice was calm but strained. "Mom, I think it's time." The drive to Cincinnati General Hospital, the same hospital where I'd worked for 30 years, where I'd delivered countless babies and comforted countless families, felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. Sarah was in the passenger seat, breathing through contractions with the focus of a woman who'd read every pregnancy book ever written, the compass glinting at her throat with each breath. The familiar corridors of the hospital felt different now that I was walking them as a family member rather than a nurse. The smell of antiseptic and floor wax, the sound of monitors beeping and pages being called over the intercom, all of it was the same, but my perspective had shifted completely. I wasn't the professional caregiver anymore. I was the terrified grandmother-to-be, praying that everything would go smoothly. "I wish Dad could be here," she said between contractions, her hand pressed to her belly, her knuckles white with the effort of managing the pain. "He is here," I told her, meaning it more than I'd ever meant anything. "He's been here all along." The labor was long but uncomplicated. Sarah was strong, just like David had predicted she'd be, and she faced each contraction with the same determined stubbornness that had gotten her through childhood scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. She'd inherited David's refusal to give up, his ability to endure whatever life threw at him with grace and determination. I held her hand through the worst of it, whispering the same words David used to whisper to me during my difficult moments. "You can do this, sweetheart. You're stronger than you know." The hours passed in a blur of breathing exercises and ice chips, of walking the corridors when she could and resting when she couldn't, of watching the monitors that tracked her progress and the baby's heartbeat. The delivery room was filled with the controlled chaos that accompanies every birth. Nurses moving efficiently, monitors beeping steadily, the doctor speaking in calm, reassuring tones. But underneath it all was an undercurrent of anticipation, of miracle about to unfold, of life preparing to make its grand entrance into the world. When the baby finally arrived, a perfect, healthy boy with David's dark hair and Sarah's gentle eyes, the delivery room fell silent, except for his first cry. It was a sound that seemed to echo through the years, connecting past to present, grandfather to grandson, love to love across the generations. Sarah reached for him immediately, and as the nurse placed him in her arms, something extraordinary happened that I'll never forget as long as I live. The compass, which had been hanging around Sarah's neck throughout the entire labor, began to glow, not with reflected light from the overhead fixtures, but with its own inner radiance, as if it had been waiting for this moment, this completion of the circle that connected past to present to future. The metal seemed to pulse with warmth, and the needle inside spun slowly, as if it were recalibrating itself to point toward this new life, this new direction for our family's journey. "Look," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with wonder and exhaustion and overwhelming joy. "Look at the compass." Everyone in the room saw it. The nurses, the doctor, even the orderly who'd been cleaning in the corner. The compass glowed for exactly 30 seconds, long enough for us all to witness something that defied explanation, something that belonged more to the realm of miracles than to the sterile reality of a hospital delivery room. And then it returned to its normal appearance as if nothing had happened, leaving us all wondering if we'd imagined it. But something had happened. In that moment, I felt David's presence more strongly than I had since the day he died. Not the aching absence I'd carried for 24 years, but his actual presence, warm and loving and proud. He was there in the delivery room, meeting his grandson, blessing the continuation of his legacy, letting us know that love truly does transcend death. Sarah looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, her hair damp with sweat, her eyes bright with the euphoria that follows childbirth. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "He was here," I managed to whisper. "He was here to meet his grandson." The baby, whom Sarah had decided to name David James after his grandfather, seemed to look directly at the compass as he nursed for the first time. His tiny fingers reached toward it, as if he recognized something familiar, something that connected him to the grandfather he'd never meet, but would always carry in his heart. The nurses moved around us with practiced efficiency, but I could see the wonder in their eyes, the way they kept glancing at the compass as if expecting it to glow again. Word spread quickly through the maternity ward about the mysterious light that had appeared at the moment of birth, and by evening, we'd had visits from nurses who'd worked at the hospital for decades, all of them wanting to hear the story of the compass that had welcomed a new life into the world. Later that evening, as Sarah slept and I held my grandson in the hospital chair beside her bed, I finally understood the full circle of love that had brought us to this moment. David's pension money had paid for the baby shower that had reconnected Sarah to her father's memory. The mysterious compass had appeared to guide her back to the love she'd never really lost. The letters had given her his voice across the years. And now, his great-grandson bore his name and his legacy, blessed by a light that had no earthly explanation, but felt as real as the baby in my arms. "Your grandfather loved you before you were even born," I whispered to the sleeping baby, his tiny face peaceful in the dim light of the hospital room. "Just like he loved your mother, just like he loved me. That love doesn't die, sweetheart. It just finds new ways to show itself." The compass lay against Sarah's chest as she slept, no longer glowing, but somehow still radiant with the love it had carried across decades and generations. Tomorrow, I would tell her the rest of the story, about the other letters David had written, the ones meant for his grandchildren, the ones that had been waiting in the attic for this very moment. But tonight, I simply held my grandson and felt the presence of the man who'd made it all possible, whose love had guided us through 24 years of separation and brought us to this perfect moment of reunion. What would you do in my place? Would you believe in love that transcends death? Please subscribe and let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced something that couldn't be explained but felt absolutely real. 6 months have passed since little David James was born, and our lives have settled into a rhythm that feels both new and ancient. Sarah brings the baby to visit every Sunday, and we sit in the living room where his grandfather once read bedtime stories, where 3 generations of love now converge in ways that still take my breath away. The house has transformed completely since David James arrived. What was once a quiet museum of memories has become a vibrant home again, filled with the sounds of laughter and crying, of Sarah's voice singing lullabies, and my own voice reading the same stories David once read to her. The baby's things are scattered throughout the rooms. A bouncy seat in the kitchen where I can watch him while I cook, a playmat in the living room where he practices rolling over, a high chair that's still too big for him but waits patiently for the day he'll need it. The compass has become a family heirloom, passed from Sarah to her son during his fussy moments. Somehow, whenever she places it near him, he calms immediately, his tiny fingers reaching for the metal that once guided his grandfather safely home. The compass seems to pulse with warmth when he touches it, and his eyes, so much like David's, focus on it with an intensity that suggests recognition, as if he remembers something from before his birth, some connection that transcends the physical world. Sarah has had it appraised and discovered it's worth far more than we'd imagined. It's a genuine World War II Navy compass, the kind issued to officers on destroyers in the Pacific Theater. The appraiser, an elderly man who specialized in military antiques, had held it with reverence and told us stories of similar compasses that had guided ships through some of the most dangerous waters in naval history. But its real value can't be measured in dollars. It's priceless in the way that love is priceless, in the way that family connections transcend material worth. I've given Sarah all of David's letters now, including the ones he wrote for his future grandchildren. The discovery of these letters had been almost as emotional as finding the first batch. Hidden in a separate box, wrapped in tissue paper and tied with a blue ribbon, were birthday letters for David James's 1st through 18th birthdays, letters for his graduation, his wedding day, his own journey into fatherhood. David's love reaches forward through time like ripples on a pond, touching lives he never lived to see, but somehow knew would need his guidance. One letter, marked, "For my grandson's first Christmas," brought us both to tears. David had written, "I hope you're reading this while watching your son discover the magic of Christmas morning. I hope his eyes light up the way your mother's did when she was small, the way yours probably did too. I may not be there to see it, but I'm there in the traditions you'll create, in the stories you'll tell, in the love that connects our family across time. The pension money is gone now, spent on the baby shower that changed everything, but it served its purpose perfectly. It was never really money anyway. It was David's final gift, his way of ensuring that his love would find its way to his daughter when she needed it most. Sarah has started a college fund for David James with her own money, but she says she's going to tell him someday about the grandfather who loved him enough to provide for celebrations he'd never see. We've established new traditions too. Every Sunday, after Sarah and the baby leave, I sit in David's old recliner and read to his photo from the baby book Sarah has started. I tell him about his grandson's first smile, his first laugh, the way he looks around the room as if he's searching for someone just out of sight. Sometimes I swear I can feel David listening, can sense his presence in the way the afternoon light falls across his photograph, in the way the house seems to hold its breath during these one-sided conversations. Sarah has changed too, in ways that go beyond the obvious transformation of becoming a mother. The woman who once called David Dad in that distant way now speaks of him as if she'd known him all her life. She tells David James stories about his grandfather, shows him photos, plays the old recordings of David reading bedtime stories. The baby seems to recognize his grandfather's voice, growing quiet and attentive whenever those familiar tones fill the room, his tiny hands reaching toward the speakers as if he's trying to touch the source of that beloved sound. "I understand now," Sarah told me last Sunday as we watched David James sleep in the same bassinet that had once held her, the one David had painted with tiny sailboats and anchors. "I understand why you kept his memory so close, why you protected it like a treasure. But I also understand why you finally shared it. Love isn't meant to be hoarded. It's meant to be passed down, generation to generation, like a flame that never goes out." The compass sits on the mantel now when it's not with the baby, catching the light from the window where David's photo stands. Sometimes I catch Sarah talking to it, the same way I used to talk to David's picture, and I know she's found her own way to maintain that connection across the years. She's started a journal for David James, writing letters to him about his grandfather, about the family history he'll inherit, about the love that connects them all. Last week, Sarah brought me a gift that took my breath away, a professional portrait of 4 generations. In the photo, I'm holding David James while Sarah stands behind us, her hand on my shoulder. But what makes the picture special is the way the photographer captured David's photo in the background, slightly out of focus but clearly present, and the compass in the foreground, glinting in the light like a bridge between past and present. 4 generations, Sarah had written on the back of the frame, past, present, and future, all connected by love. I keep that photo on my nightstand now, and every morning when I wake up, I'm reminded that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, evolves, finds new ways to express itself across time and space, and the mysterious connections that bind families together. David's love guided him safely home from war, guided me through 24 years of single motherhood, guided Sarah back to the father she'd never really lost, and now guides his grandson into a future bright with possibility. The baby shower was just the beginning. The real gift wasn't the elegant decorations or the perfect venue or even the mysterious appearance of the compass. The real gift was the understanding that love is the only thing that truly lasts, the only inheritance that matters, the only legacy worth leaving. David James will grow up knowing his grandfather not as a distant figure in old photographs, but as a living presence in his life. He'll carry David's compass, read David's letters, hear David's voice in the recordings that have waited decades to find their audience. He'll know that love transcends death, that family is forever, and that sometimes the most important gifts come wrapped in mystery and delivered by hands we can no longer see but can always feel. As I write this, sitting in David's old chair with his great-grandson sleeping in my arms, I can feel the circle completing itself. The pension money that brought us together, the compass that guided us home, the letters that carried love across the years, they were all part of a plan bigger than any of us understood at the time. Thank God I didn't tell Sarah about the pension money at the baby shower. Thank God I waited for the right moment. For the moment when she was ready to receive not just the truth about the money, but the deeper truth about the love that had been guiding us all along. Some secrets are worth keeping until the time is right to share them. Some gifts are worth waiting a lifetime to give. And some love is so strong, so pure, so determined to endure, that not even death can silence it. The compass continues to glow softly whenever David James is near, a gentle reminder that love finds a way, always finds a way, to bridge the gap between what was and what is, between memory and hope, between the grandfather who couldn't stay and the grandson who carries his legacy forward into tomorrow. The end.